our first lecture on the respiratory system, we are going to be discussing the 4 stages of respiration, some of the gas laws, and some disorders that are associated with each stage. So when we discuss the stages of respiration, the first of them is what a lot of times people consider and kind of just stop the thought process at pulmonary respiration, which is where we're inhaling and exhaling air all the way into our lungs, into the alveolar sacs of our lungs, the alveoli. The second stage is external respiration, where that air that is inhaled and exhaled has to be somehow passed into the blood or out of the blood at those alveolar sacs through the walls of the alveoli. Third, once we have gases in the blood, we have to be able to transport them. So that's the third stage. And then the fourth stage is, if you follow the pathway of oxygen, for example, you need to be able to, once it's been transported through the blood, it's going to be coming into close contact with the cells of the body, and those cells need to be able to take it in. And in the reverse, carbon dioxide needs to be released. So internal respiration is where we're doing the exchange between the blood and then those vascular tissues of the body where cells will now be respiring. And at the end of the day, that's actually the whole point. That's the whole point of the respiratory system, is that those cells of the body are eventually able to take in oxygen and release this waste product, carbon dioxide. Internal respiration really is the point of the whole thing. And so we go through a lot of trouble getting those gases into the body and through the blood and eventually to those tissues, or away from those tissues, depending on which gas you are considering. So let's state the 2 gases. The 2 biggies are oxygen, which we will be marking in red throughout this lecture, and carbon dioxide, which we will be marking in blue. Now let's start off with pulmonary ventilation and explore this topic. So we start off with the mouth and the nose, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, and then the larynx. These would be considered the upper respiratory tract. And then we move into the lower respiratory tract, which would include the trachea, the bronchi, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, ensuing branches of these very cartilaginous structures, which still have a mucous membrane lining the inside. That's important, but they're made of hyaline cartilage on the outside, so they're quite stiff. And then bronchioles, further and further dividing into smaller and smaller passageways that begin to lose that cartilaginous exterior and become soft tissues themselves. And lastly, we end up in the alveolar sacs, or the alveoli themselves. And this, of course, is where we're going to go on to our next stage, which is external respiration. But it's worth being quite deliberate on this topic and making sure we understand that oxygen is going to be passing downward through all these things: mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles to the alveoli. And carbon dioxide is going to be doing the opposite. It starts at the alveolus at its highest concentration, and then it moves upward through all of these passageways: bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, larynx, pharynx, and then out of the mouth and nose, where it's going to be exhaled. I like to draw a small alveolar sac here just for that pictorial connection of oxygen coming into the alveolar sac and then carbon dioxide leaving the alveolar sac. At the end of the day, that's what pulmonary ventilation is all about. All these passageways are all about just making sure that the gases are properly brought into and out of those alveoli. Now, I want to draw some representative tubes here, which would represent, the bronchi, for example. I'm not going to be doing it in a lot of detail here, but I want to give you the idea that there's going to be a lumen in the center, and then there's going to be a mucosa around that. There's going to be structure to these walls. Of course, this is a mucosa, so it's going to have all the lymphatic structures, lymphatic follicles, and so on. Remember, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And so it's important that that tube is hollow and nicely structured, that there's this mucosa around it, but that it is open. This is important. It's open. It's a fairly open tube that pretty much allows for free passage of air back and forth, because at the end of the day, what you really want is that air to get in and out of the alveoli with as little impediment as possible. So let's take a look at what can go wrong here. We're going to be drawing our disorders today in green, and the first disorder we're going to look at is asthma. Asthma is a condition that can sometimes be caused by particulate matter in the air, or it may be caused by somewhat of an allergic reaction, or, well, there's various causes, but the basic idea of asthma is that those walls of the bronchi start to close in a bit. The mucosa becomes inflamed. There's a great deal of mucus production. And so what I'm drawing here are walls that are, like, the lumen is much smaller. Hopefully you can see this. The lumen is much smaller. And also there's some mucosa. There's some mucus. It's actual, like, excess mucus production. So I just drew a little bit of extra green in there. But the basic idea of an inflammation is that it's a serious breach of the ability of pulmonary ventilation to occur. It's going to be causing inflammation and excess mucus production. So the treatment here is to somehow open up those airways as quickly as possible, because when people are suffering from an asthma attack, it is panic-inducing and it can be life-threatening. So we use an inhaler, of course. What's present in the inhaler is a bronchodilator and steroids, and this helps to open things up fairly quickly. The bronchodilator is a substance that allows for the relaxation of the muscles surrounding the lumen to allow them to widen and allow that lumen to get wider. And steroids are responsible for mitigating inflammation. Right, let's talk about the first of our gas laws. Boyles Law is the idea that when you expand the chest cavity, you allow air to rush in. When you reduce the volume of the chest cavity, you allow air to push out. This is going to be somewhat pairing with the idea of Dalton's law, which is the idea that partial pressures add up to the total pressure of, the atmosphere, is what we're usually discussing here. So to be clear, Boyles Law is talking about inhalation and exhalation, which is directly tied to pulmonary ventilation in the first place. Boyles Law is the idea that there are muscles involved. The diaphragm, the external intercostal muscles are involved in when they are contracted. They pull the thoracic cavity outward and downward and allows for expansion, which pulls air in or inhale, and you allow for inhalation or inspiration of air all the way down into the alveoli. And the opposite is true. When these muscles, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscle, are relaxed, they pull back together, and that allows for a reduction in the volume, and therefore the pressure allows for the reduction of pressure in that the increase of pressure in that case is going to allow air to flow out or be expired or exhaled from the lungs. Anyway, we'll be covering this a little bit more in the next lecture. I think I'll come back to the topic because it's an important one. I don't want to dwell on it too much. You always want to, like, how much do I really want to say about a particular topic? But I think we'll pull it back a little bit more in the next lecture. Right, let's discuss Dalton's law then. We're going to be looking at this point, in regards to this particular stage, we're going to be looking at atmospheric air. What is the partial pressure of each of the basically 3 or 4 main gases in the external, in the atmosphere itself? And so this pertains to Dalton's law of partial pressures. When we write the partial pressure of a gas, we write a capital P, and then in a small subscript next to it, we write what the gas is that we're addressing in that moment. So the big ones are the partial pressure of nitrogen, the partial pressure of aerial oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and then in this case, we're going to go ahead and write the partial pressure of water as well. So the main gas in our atmosphere is nitrogen. So the partial pressure of nitrogen is 597 millimeters of mercury. Then next up is oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 159 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is quite small at 0.3 millimeters of mercury, and then the partial pressure of water is 3.7 millimeters of mercury. Now, this is in proportion to the actual percentages of these gases in the air, and so it might be helpful to note that the percentage of oxygen in our air, at least at sea level, is about 20%, and that corresponds with its partial pressure. So all of these added up together at sea level is about 760. So 760 millimeters of mercury is the equivalent of 1 atmosphere, which is the pressure of the air at sea level. So again, Dalton's law of partial pressures is that each of the gases in a particular area adds up to the partial pressure of each adds up to the total air pressure in that region. Right, I think we've said enough about pulmonary ventilation. Let's move on to external respiration. We are going to draw an alveolar sac. We're going to draw this about 3 different ways, but here's one way to do it, is to draw sort of a little cloud there. Here's our alveolar sac. And we're going to go ahead and draw one single, it's not quite representative, but to show generally how this works, we're going to draw one blood vessel or one capillary bed that sort of straps around this alveolar sac. You'll notice right away that this is kind of a backwards version of a capillary bed that we've dealt with before, because usually capillary beds start off red and then they end up blue, but in this case we're actually starting off blue and ending red. Blue, the color blue, represents blood that is lesser oxygenated, and red represents blood that is fully oxygenated. So, that's what the lungs do. They actually allow for blood to become fully oxygenated, and so it's going to go from blue to red. Now, inside of the alveolus, inside of the lumen of the alveolus, we have 40 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide and 104 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. This is different than it existed in the air. Remember that our partial pressure of oxygen was 159 and it's gone down to 104. And in the atmosphere, our partial pressure of carbon dioxide was quite low at 0.3, and it's come all the way up to 40. And the reason for that is that inside of the alveolus, not all of the air is released or brought in perfectly well. There's always some air that is actually left behind in the alveolus, and that's important. There's a substance called surfactant in the alveolus which allows it to remain expanded and open. But the other thing that allows it to remain expanded and open is that it always retains some air, some residual volume inside of that alveolus. And so you're always going to have some air held back. So anyway, the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveolus, quite important that you know these ones. 40 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide and 104 millimeters of mercury for oxygen in the lumen of the alveolus. Let's do a little bit of a picture to note what's actually happening here. Carbon dioxide is going to be brought out of the blood. Oxygen is going to be brought into the blood. We're going to be exchanging from that blood vessel into the lumen of the, back and forth between the lumen of the alveolus and the blood vessel itself. And so let us first describe what's happening as blood enters into this capillary bed surrounding the alveolus. You notice the partial pressure of oxygen is 40. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 millimeters of mercury. Compare the numbers. When we look at the blood that is blue coming in, it's at 40 for oxygen, but the lumen of the alveolus is 104. The blood coming in to the alveolus that surrounds the alveolus is at 45 for carbon dioxide, but the lumen of the alveolus is 40. So try to rectify those two things in your mind and understand that what has to happen here is that we need to be able to exchange these things without too much energy. It's going to be passive diffusion, where we're going to take things from where they are higher in concentration and exchange them into a region where they are lower in concentration. Therefore, since oxygen is lower in the blood, it's going to be exchanged into the lumen. And since carbon dioxide is lower in the lumen, it's going to be exchanged into the blood. We're going to be equalizing these two numbers, equalizing the numbers. So on the other side of the alveolus then, as blood is leaving out of this region, you're going to have numbers in the blood that are reflective of what was happening inside of the lumen of the alveolus. So the partial pressure of oxygen is 104, same as it was in the alveolus. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40, same as it was in the lumen of the alveolus. We've equalized the numbers. Let's go ahead and take a look at what can go wrong here. Here's another depiction of the alveolar sac. It kind of looks like this. It looks like a bunch of grapes. And what is supposed to happen is that you are supposed to have basically a large number of small grapes that have nice, robust walls. Each of them has a good, solid, well-developed wall. The walls are made of simple squamous epithelium. Now, what can happen over time, or due to some diseases, for example, is that those simple squamous epithelial cells can start to break down, and the walls of the alveoli start to literally disappear. This would be considered emphysema. And the problem with emphysema is that there is simply less cells for this exchange, this gas exchange, to take place in. Less surface area. We haven't discussed surface area specifically. We haven't discussed it much in this course at all, but the reality is that all physiological processes that we pay attention to, almost all of them happen through a membrane, and this is the perfect example. You have to have a good membrane in order to allow for efficient gas exchange. When you start to lose that surface area, when you start to lose those membranes, this reduces your ability to actually do the physiological function, in this case, gas exchange. If you don't have enough walls, enough alveolar sacs, enough alveolar walls, you simply cannot exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen properly. So what happens is, over time, the first stage, pulmonary ventilation, starts to ramp up to try to accommodate this inefficiency that's happening at step 2, at external respiration. So what happens in the later stages of emphysema is that people start to become very weak, and the reason for that is that there isn't that much energy left for regular muscle movement or regular physiology that's supposed to happen in the rest of the body. Because in the end stages of emphysema, about 20% of the body's energy is devoted just to breathing, to inspiring and expiring air. This is again going back to the idea of pulmonary ventilation, trying to make up for the issues here in stage 2 at the exchange level. Normally, we devote about 5% of our body's energy to pulmonary ventilation, but with, they're basically, what I'm trying to say is there's no fix for emphysema. It's a degenerative disease. Over time, when those alveolar walls break down, there's really no getting them back. Like, once they've developed very early in life, it's kind of a tricky business to get them to develop properly in the first place. So once they start to break down, you really can't redevelop them. So there's no actual cure for emphysema or for any disease, COVID being one of them, which starts to obliterate those cells in the walls of the alveolar, in the walls of the alveoli. All you can do is try to get as much oxygen in through pulmonary ventilation in order to allow for the most efficient exchange possible, but it's quite tricky once you just don't have those that nice alveolar structure anymore. So emphysema is this degenerative disease that sometimes can be mistaken for an issue with pulmonary ventilation, but the reality is it's actually a problem with external respiration. And so it's worth noting that when a person has problems with their alveoli, with the emphysema, or with other diseases that start to take away some of that external respiration ability, there's really that you can't really cure that problem by any means. You certainly can't cure it with the same means that cured, for example, pulmonary ventilation. You can't use like an inhaler to try to open up the airways. That doesn't really help with external respiration. There is actually no cure. We can try to make pulmonary ventilation as easy as possible, but there's really only so much you can do. At some point, a person it does tend to be a life-limiting illness. Right, let's move on to our next gas law, which is Henry's Law. I forgot to write Henry's Law, but that's what we're stating here. Henry's Law. William Henry did his work in the 1800s. Pretty cool. But anyway, Henry's Law of partial pressure states that a greater concentration of gas goes into solution faster, more efficiently, than a lower concentration of gas. So the gases will dissolve into a solution, and the solution we're interested in here is, of course, the blood, which brings us actually to our next stage, which is gas transport. But I wanted to just state this out kind of as a separate topic because it kind of goes in between several topics. greater concentration of gas goes into solution faster than a lower concentration of gas. Gases will dissolve in the blood in proportion to their partial pressures. But it also is worth noting that the gases also dissolve in proportion to their solubility. Nitrogen, although it's very high in proportion as far as its partial pressure, it pretty much is not dissolved in our blood at all, at least not at sea level, at regular pressures, regular aerial pressures. Nitrogen is basically insoluble in the blood. And so, although it is a very high partial pressure, we do not tend to dissolve nitrogen into our blood. Oxygen is only slightly more soluble than nitrogen, and so oxygen doesn't tend to dissolve easily in the blood either. But carbon dioxide is actually our most soluble gas as far as the ones we're dealing with today. So carbon dioxide actually dissolves easily into the blood, and therefore its solubility is the highest, and it is actually transported to a certain extent simply by dissolving in the blood and being able to transport that way. Right, but of course when we think about gas transport in the blood, we're probably going to be thinking about hemoglobin. So let's go ahead and draw some red blood cells. And my little shorthand for hemoglobin that I came up with is just a few figure eights, kind of. It's much better than the last time I tried to draw this. And we got to remember those heme pigments in the center of each of those globins. Hemoglobin is a subset of 4 subunits, each of them having a heme pigment or a heme pigment in the center, which binds oxygen and carbon dioxide, by the way. However, we also have a different version of hemoglobin, which is called methemoglobin or methemoglobin. And it turns out that most of your red blood cells are filled with hemoglobin, but you will have a small proportion of methemoglobin. So in the center of that heme pigment, or in the center of that heme pigment, you have an atom that is an iron atom. Now, if it is an Fe2+, this would be a good, strong binding to oxygen and allows for efficient oxygen transport. In normal conditions, more than 99% of your hemoglobins are, in fact, hemoglobins. But if that iron is an Fe3+, this is less efficient. And allows for less efficient oxygen transport. Less than 1% of your hemoglobins are going to be methemoglobins under normal conditions. And the Fe2+ is considered the ferrous hemoglobin, and Fe3+ is ferric hemoglobin. Right, now let's talk about a condition where the methemoglobin is quite high. It's called methemoglobinemia. You have too many methemoglobins. I think it's defined specifically as greater than 7%. Remember that normally you have fewer than 1%. But if you have greater than 7% methemoglobins, you will have very inefficient oxygen transport ability. And this will tend to lead to cyanotic skin, or skin that takes on a blue coloration, quite an obvious issue. Hard to hide. So I have seen levels as high as 80%. There are certain families, the Martin Fugate family of Appalachia being one family that seemed to have this condition and carried it on for a generation after generation, and was about 150 years, maybe 160 years that they continue to suffer from this disorder. Not much is known about the family. It is thought that they were pretty healthy. They did keep reproducing and having babies and living fairly long lives, and so it's possible that you can live with this condition called methemoglobinemia and have a relatively healthy life for a long time, but you would of course have blue skin, methemoglobinemia. Right, let's talk about we've been talking about hemoglobin. Let's be clear that about 98.5% of your oxygen is transported attached to hemoglobin. And in fact, once oxygen is released on the other side of the blood, it tends to happen that carbon dioxide will also attach to hemoglobin coming on back. And about 20% of your carbon dioxide is transported this way. It's worth noting at this point that about 7% of your carbon dioxide is transported by simply dissolving itself. As we said, carbon dioxide is quite soluble, so it's able to simply dissolve in the blood. But most of your carbon dioxide is transported in the form of carbonate ions, HCO3 minus or NaHCO3, and we're going to be talking about that in 2 lectures from now more, but I thought I'd just make a note of it right now to be clear. So you can transport a small amount of carbon dioxide attached to hemoglobin, especially if the hemoglobin is no longer attached to oxygen, but most of your carbon dioxide is transported in other ways. Hemoglobin is most important, of course, for oxygen transport. Oxygen is not very soluble, and this is really almost the entire way that oxygen is transported through the blood is attached to hemoglobin. Right, let's move on to our last stage of respiration, which would be internal respiration. All of your vascular tissues are going to be receiving oxygen this way, and even avascular tissues will eventually, through the interstitial fluid, be receiving oxygen this way and releasing carbon dioxide this way. So what happens in internal respiration, this is the exchange at the level of the tissues. In external respiration was the exchange at the level of the alveoli. Internal respiration is exchange at the level of the tissues. And what's going to happen here is that, of course, we're bringing red blood into the region and we're bringing blue blood away. Let's go ahead and draw a tissue around here. I'm going to be deliberate and draw some hexagons here with some little nuclei in the center. This is my humble depiction of the beautiful hepatocytes in the liver. We just don't talk about the liver enough in this class. We just don't have time for it, but it's an amazing organ of the body with these amazing cells that are completely non-redundant. Nothing else in the body does anything like it. So we have these cells, in this case of the liver, but keep in mind this could be any tissue of the body. I just wanted to give you like a specific tissue to think about so that it's just a theoretical idea. I want you to picture what's really happening. We're bringing oxygen into a tissue. This could be muscle cells or fat cells or epithelial cells, but we're just choosing to use the liver. So we're bringing oxygenated blood into this tissue, and then we're going to be removing blue blood out, or blood that is lower in oxygen. And why? Why does this happen this way? Well, it turns out if you talk about cells that are nice and healthy and respiring properly and engaging with their environment properly, they're going to be sucking up oxygen from their interstitial fluid, which means that you will have a paucity of oxygen. The partial pressure here surrounding very metabolic cells would be less than 40. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide would be quite high at greater than 45. And so we have this interstitial fluid surrounding these tissues. As long as the tissue is nice and healthy, you're going to expect to have low levels of oxygen and high levels of carbon dioxide. As opposed to the blood that is coming into the region is going to be high in oxygen at 100, the partial pressure of oxygen being 100 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide being relatively low at 40. And now let's compare this to the way that it looked when it was leaving out of the alveoli. Remember that what happened in the lungs as blood made its way through the lungs is that the partial pressure of oxygen was raised to 104 and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide was 40. Well, you'll notice there's a little bit of a difference there. It turns out that the lungs as a whole, not every single alveolus is exchanging at the same time or at the same rate. So yes, one particular alveolus, when everything is going perfectly, will leave oxygen at 104, but the lungs as a whole are going to be leaving the blood supply at a partial pressure of oxygen of 100. So that is why once you get to the tissues of the body, the number just dips slightly down to 100 is the partial pressure of oxygen as you approach a tissue of the body. Well, remember that what's going to happen here is we have to have passive exchange, diffusion, where structures are going from a high concentration to a low concentration. They're going to be moving through a membrane from where they are highly concentrated to an area where they are less concentrated. Therefore, we're going to be equalizing these numbers. And the numbers we're going to equalize is the numbers from the blood and the numbers from the tissues. We're going to be exchanging this as efficiently as possible into and out of the blood supply and into and out of the interstitial fluid that is surrounding these tissues. So what ends up happening is the blood leaving out of the tissues is going to be reflective of the numbers that were in the interstitial fluid surrounding the tissues. So the partial pressure of oxygen goes down to 40 in the blood because we have oxygen leaving the blood and entering the interstitial fluid therefore entering the cells. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide as we leave out of this tissue, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is actually going to go up, because that is going to be reflective of the interstitial fluid that was left behind by these highly metabolic cells that are taking up lots of oxygen and leaving off lots of carbon dioxide. And so that is actually the same exact numbers. These stay exactly the same all the way up to the lungs. So the oxygen entering the lungs will be at a partial pressure of oxygen of 40, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 45. Well, so what can go wrong? I looked up a condition called alcoholic liver disease. So a person who's had decades-long issues with alcohol. There's no surprise here. We know that alcohol is a toxin, but specifically, how is it a toxin? It tends to break down membranes in the body. And another thing that happens is the liver cells themselves, the hepatocytes of the liver, tend to become quite damaged, because one of the jobs of the liver is to take in toxins such as oxygen and store them away. So oftentimes the liver is sort of at the front line of alcohol liver disease, and some of the cells here are going to be some of the first to actually shut down. And so what specifically happens here is that the cells are, many things that happen, but one of the things that pertains to the unit that we're discussing right now is that these hepatocytes are unable, in some cases, to take up oxygen efficiently. And so what will happen is, at least in the liver, you will tend to have inefficient exchange. Carbon dioxide will not be released at as high of a level as it would be in a healthy tissue, and oxygen will not be taken up as efficiently as would normally happen. So that's what can go wrong at internal respiration.